Okay. 9:01, let's go ahead and bring the board meeting to order. Please everyone stand and have a moment of reflection. Today, let's keep in mind the families and victims of Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas that continue to recover from the great devastation and loss. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
As everyone can notice, the board table is getting fuller each month, and we'd like to welcome Mr. Henry Brown to the board.
Thank you.
As usual, for those in the audience and those streaming, I'd like to go around the table for just a quick introduction. Just your name, please.
Henry Brown.
Andy Allen.
Lynn Rohde.
April Green.
Aaron Zahn.
Kelly Flanagan.
Okay. Reverend Fred Newbill will be joining us. He's just running just a few minutes behind, so he'll just come in and join us at that time. Can I get a motion to adopt today's agenda?
So moved.
Second that.
All in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. Agenda adopted. Safety briefing by Mr. Zahn.
As everyone knows, safety is a core cultural value of JEA. It has been for a number of years and will continue to be as long as our field workers and our team continues to work in dangerous conditions. To that end, please identify the person to your right as your safety buddy. In the event of an emergency, can I have somebody that will dial 911? John McCarthy, thank you very much, and somebody that will perform CPR if needed. Melissa Dykes. In the event of an emergency or a fire, please proceed in an orderly fashion to the left of the elevators there at the back and down holding the handrail. We will cross and convene at the southeast corner of Church in Maine. Thank you very much.
Okay. Do we have a quorum to be able to approve them? Or should we wait for it? Okay, we're going to have, we've just approved the agenda, so now I'm going to abstain from the Appendix D, so will there be a quorum to?
We need to wait.
Yeah.
And I still need to do this.
Okay, alrighty, so we're gonna kind of skip along here. We need to have a quorum for the consent agenda. You sure? Sunshine Law by Ms. Rohde.
This meeting is subject to Florida's government in the Sunshine Law, Section 286.11011 Florida statutes, and shall be open to the public at all times.
Okay, we have a few comments from the public. Can we have Mr. James Taylor?
Good morning. I'm
morning.
speaking as a Jacksonville citizen and as a JEA customer. And with all this talk of what's going on with the recapitalization and all that, I would just like to make a suggestion. If we're going to do all this, no offense to Mr. Zahn, but I think maybe we should get somebody that's got utility experience. And, you know, that's just my opinion, and I hope you guys consider that. And I'd like to share one little story with you. I was at home yesterday fixing to mow my yard, and I looked at my water meter, had that much water sitting on top of it. So I called, they sent somebody out, and the guy showed up about 9 o'clock last night, pulled a meter can off, saw it was a leak. He got out his wrenches, fixed it, and was gone in 15 minutes. So I think that's something that we should be appreciative of and keep ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments. Casey Jones.
How you doing? Casey Jones. I'm with the Florida Sea Turtle Watch. and I just wanted to touch base with y'all. Y'all are switching out the old sodium lights and going to the super bright white LED lights. And I don't know if y'all have ever heard of light pollution, but that's the worst kind of lights that we could have, not only for the beaches, and of course, a lot of people know how bad they are for mother sea turtles. They deter the mothers from nesting. They also can kill, those lights can kill baby sea turtles. They go the wrong way, light pollution, any artificial or man-made light. So not only does it affect the beaches, but it also inland, it affects all the animals. It's actually even bad for humans now that every city is switching them over. So I would like to request to put a stop to that right now, and the crews that are putting them up, those new lights up, we order a bunch of shields. If all you have to do is shield those lights. I'm in contact with Paul and Lindsay, with y'all's environmental people, and those lights, they put some out at my house, and I've requested shields. I don't live on the beach, so it's not necessarily anything to do with sea turtles, but I requested it in January. So that was over 9 months ago. I requested 2 of my lights. They're from across the street. They shine in my backyard. I don't even need a pool light anymore because it lights up my whole backyard. And I have a pretty good sized backyard, and my neighbor next door that lives even farther away from the street. So those lights are dangerous, and I did drop off. I think everybody got one of these. So when I started this to help out the sea turtles, and then I had a guy contact me. He said, "Hey man, you need to check this out." So I wanted to leave this with y'all, and it's called International Dark Skies Association, and it just lets you know, and the studies lets you know how dangerous this kind of light pollution is, and it's such an easy fix. All you have to do is shield the lights. We put lights up to shine down on the road. You don't put the lights up to shine 3 houses over that's away from the road. That shielding keeps it where it's supposed to be, which is on the road. So if there's any way we could maybe follow up or start to get that done, it's pretty important. That's why I left this with y'all, because I only have 3 minutes. Thank y'all.
Thank you. Who should we be in contact with?
Yeah, sir. Paul Steinbrucker can meet you in the back and can address your concerns and provide you the steps that we've taken to ensure the safetiness and welfare of the sea turtles.
Thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Mr. Bruce, is that Dodek? Dueck?
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'd like to start with a quote from C.F. Kettering, American engineer, inventor, and businessman, who said, "I'm very interested in the future because I'm going to spend the rest of my life there. And I'd like to applaud your efforts for thinking out of the box and looking to evaluate all options. However, this is merely one aspect of good business planning and good business practices. Many other tools and techniques can be used: design thinking, IRP, DMAIC, decision quality framework, to name a few. You are fiduciaries of the JEA. However, as a result of JEA contributing 25% of nearly all the city revenues, you are fiduciaries for the city of Jacksonville as well. That makes you responsible for making sure all risks are managed and the utility business and the organizational financial performance advances. I have found significant errors of omission and flawed assumptions in your strategic planning scenarios. There's lack of adequate treatment of cost to service rate making. There is the lack or inappropriate treatment of solar balance of system costs in your solar parity analysis. and the IRP was not given full consideration. These omissions, in my mind, represent a violation of the public trust, creates a false narrative of the sky is falling to drive your strategic planning when your own audited financial reports and independent third-party rating agencies state otherwise. This flawed business planning is not what you want to use to drive your organization forward. With all due respect, not delaying and not correcting and not demanding complete data could compromise your fiduciary responsibility. We all must be accountable to our community, and the current ITN format and schedule, in addition, does not allow, in my opinion, a significant amount of time for what may be the community's best option, community ownership. I believe the community's best option would be a form of community ownership. Basing your planning on this faulty data is like flying across the country without an adequate flight plan, flying blind. I beg you individually and as a board to do your due diligence and delay recapitalization considerations until full vetting of the omissions are addressed, and I strongly recommend a motion be made by a member of this board under your new business to consider these flaws in strategic planning. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron, would you like to respond?
Sure, sir. I really appreciate your input and concern as a citizen of Jacksonville and a customer of JEA. To the extent you'd like to meet with us, we can address many of the issues that you brought up. We are, in fact, continuing with our IRP as well as our integrated water resource plan to ensure that we are covering the cost of service. We also are integrating, many of the points that you brought up have been considered in terms of our process. Happy to follow up with you and provide you more detail as part of Sunshine Law and give you that information.
Thank you. Councilmember Danny Beckton, you have any comments for us from the City Council?
Madam Chair, thank you.
Thank you for being here. All right, Mr. Zahn.
Sure. It is my great pleasure to honor Michael R. Hightower and to submit a resolution for the board. Whereas Michael R. Hightower was appointed to the Board of Directors of JEA, serving 2 terms from January 29, 1996 through February 28, 2004, with roles as Vice Chair from March 1st of 1999 to February 28th of 2001, and Chair of the Board from March 1st, 2001 to March 1st, 2003, and from July 6th, 2007 to December 5th, 2014, serving as Assistant Secretary. From March 1st, 2008 to February 28th, 2011, Vice Chair from March 1st, 2012 to March 19th of 2013, and Chair of the Board from March 20th, 2013 to December 5th of 2014. And whereas he served as JEA's senior leadership team as a Chief Public and Stakeholder Affairs Officer from 2015 to 2019, and was instrumental in the success of the legislation critical to municipal utilities statewide, House Bills 327 and 591, which exempt and protect our customers' meter-derived data and information from public records. This is in critical bills that were passed last year that protect our customers, if the board does remember that. Whereas he was a champion for all employees' special interests, serving on the board of the International Lineman's Museum and Hall of Fame, supporting the JEA rodeo competition teams, and sponsoring JEA's leadership in the American Association of Blacks in Energy, and JEA's Veterans Day recognition event. And whereas the board and SLT accomplished major milestones in economic development, solar expansion, and record J.D. Power's customer satisfaction scores during his tenure. Whereas his vision and foresight have been invaluable to JEA. His focus and professionalism have helped guide JEA's strategic planning and its government relations. Whereas the dedication, high ethical standards, and appreciation for all things JEA by this consummate gentleman and professional will be sadly missed by all and by the entire JEA family. Now and therefore be it resolved by the Board of Directors of JEA that it hereby expresses its deep gratitude and appreciation to Michael R. Hightower for his lasting contributions as a member of the Board of Directors, as a member of our community, and as a member of the senior leadership team of JEA. So it asks that the board consider unanimously adopting this on the date of September 21st or 24th, 2019.
Madam Chair, I want to make a motion that we receive that resolution.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Has he been the longest board member? Michael, I think you're the longest board member to serve at this table, and I think we need to file a motion to have your head bust.
Probably the oldest person. Yes. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I'm not gonna never provide mic with a mic. Let me first to the board thank you. It is a great honor. To my colleagues of the senior leadership team, it's been a great honor to have sat there and to be a part of there. There's probably no greater honor. As I'm approaching 75 years young, I'm sort of it's a neat way to reflect back on the many gifts that God has given my wife and I. There's a couple folks that I do want to say thank you, of course, to Karen, to the senior leadership, Melissa, everyone, but to Melinda, Madrika, Brandy, Nancy, thank you for your IT work. You've made me a legend in my own mind. That was the greatest loss when I went home and I went, oh my God, I'm on my own now. So I think I probably violated everything. To the rodeo guys and to Miss Beverly, thank you for the honor of being a part of them. I think I shocked them the first time they saw me in boots and jeans. It worked out after 2 years. To my colleagues at AID, what you all do and the role that you set and the opportunities that you are providing for everyone in our minority community, JEA is the place to be. So to all of you, it has been the greatest 20 years of my life. I will tell you, I know we're here about energy, but I have spent the last 3 months in North Carolina. The 30 degrees difference between there and here is pretty extraordinary. I would just suggest that you do it. To thank all of you all, thank you for the great honor it is. I just sort of look back as I look back at all this. Next month will be my 60th year of working, and on January 10th, 2021 will be my 50th year of being in politics. So I'm now working on 2 campaigns. So anything I can ever do for JEA, but for the city of Jacksonville. I wish this board incredible luck and best wishes. You've got tough decisions, but I know that in your heart you know what's right for our community. You've got a great organization. You've got the greatest senior leadership team behind you, and they'll do the right thing. Thank you, and I hope if you all's retirement is half as good as mine, you will be very blessed. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think a bus would look really good.
I
right there
agree.
in the middle. Okay, we're going to move forward with the consent agenda. Actually going to break the consent agenda up a little differently. Appendix D, the real estate acceptance of 2470 Talleyrand Avenue. I will abstain from that vote due to personal conflict. I am married to a leader of Jacksport. So can I get a motion? So we are going to move Appendix D out of the consent agenda. There you go. So we will move for a motion to accept the consent agenda without Appendix D.
So moved, Madam Chair.
Second.
Any questions or discussion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, do the same. Consent agenda has been approved, minus Appendix D. So I will abstain from the Appendix D. Can I ask for the motion, or should I?
Anyone can present a motion.
Okay.
Mr. Hahn can see if anyone will present.
Would anybody like to present a motion for the approval of Appendix D on the consent agenda, item 3A4?
Madam Chair, I want to present a motion on Appendix D, item 3 and 4.
3A4.
3A4.
Second.
It has been, well,
It
I
has
don't
been
care.
moved and seconded. Now you may ask for a vote.
It has been moved and seconded, and you can ask for a vote. So all those in favor of approval of item 3A4, say aye.
Aye.
And this is the real estate acceptance 2470 Talleyrand Avenue.
Correct.
Right.
You may move on to item B.
Okay. Monthly reports.
So I'd ask Mr. Wanamaker and Ms. Dykes to come up and present an operations and finance update. This will be the final one of our fiscal year, and so we have brought a bit more elaboration in terms of where we ended up from a performance perspective, operationally and financially for the fiscal year of 2018-2019.
Thank you. We're behind tab 3C. And typically in these discussions, I tend to highlight the metrics or the areas where we're challenged for the year. So we've talked in prior months about some of the challenges we've had around water distribution system pressure that was driven by extreme drought and heat conditions, particularly in the month of May, where we were managing system pressure to provide for fire protection for the community. But that caused us to miss that metric for the year. Generation fleet reliability is another area we've been challenged this year. We have one unit in particular that's had some operational issues, and that's caused us to miss this metric for the year. As we round the corner into the end of the year, though, what I wanted to do was take a more balanced approach to reporting out on the dashboard for the year. We've had an incredibly strong year operationally and financially. Our electric debt is the lowest it's been in 34 years. 34 years. Water debt is the lowest it's been in 16 years. Our operational and customer service levels are best in class, and the actions we've taken down to pay down debt and de-risk the business are what provide us the luxury of being able to have strategic planning discussions in a thoughtful and deliberate manner. And I want to highlight just a couple of the metrics on the dashboard, starting with J.D. Power customer satisfaction. For residential customers, this has been a journey for us. When we started on this journey in 2012, we were the bottom of the fourth quartile in customer satisfaction. We improved faster than any other utility in the history of the J.D. Power Index, and we continue to improve so that this year, even with all of the community discussion we've been having around the future of JEA, we posted the highest ever residential customer satisfaction score that we've ever had. In the electric system distribution grid reliability, we track a metric called CME5. And CME5 stands for customers experiencing multiple interruptions. These are tracking the number of customers who have had 5 or more interruptions in a year. We started tracking this metric about 4 years ago to align with metrics that the investor-owned utilities in the state track. So this is a pretty standard metric that's tracked, and we set a bar for ourselves to do at least as well as the IOUs in the state. But I distinctly recall when we adopted the metric that we agreed to put it on the dashboard, we agreed to chase it, but our voltage is different than the investor-owned utilities in the state, which means we have longer runs in the distribution system. So when we have an outage, we're likely to impact more customers. So although we adopted the metric, we never thought we were going to get to the performance that the investor-owned utilities have. Fast forward to this year, we are doing so well in this metric that we're going to throw away the metric next year. We're going to replace it with CME4 because we have so few customers that are experiencing 5 or more interruptions because of the way we've programmatically improved the distribution system, and that we're going to start chasing customers who have even fewer outages. So it's just a phenomenal success story in terms of electric performance. And finally, I want to highlight environmental impact in the wastewater system, which is another just outstanding metric. We track our nitrogen to the river as an important component of our impact on the environment. And this chart that's on this page shows all the way back to 1997 the amount of nitrogen that we've discharged to the river. And what you can see in this chart is it's the lowest it's ever been in the history of the city of Jacksonville. And that's in spite of increasing population. So people aren't flushing the toilet less. We're just doing a much better job with managing our impact on the environment. It's a really great story of what happens when you combine the ingenuity of our employees with a metric that we're tracking on our dashboard.
So I'm going to talk about a couple of financial and community impact metrics. The first one is the O&M forecast percent of net O&M budget. This has been a tight metric for us all year. I believe we're going to be in the meets category on this one, which is 95 to 97.5% of budget. We have a chance it exceeds, but I think it's going to come down to about $1 to $2 million either way. So I think the takeaway there is we set a pretty good target, and we're going to be striving to try to get there. On the other one is capital invested in the system. It's a little bit of a similar story on capital. This is really going to come down to the final days. The meets exceeds goal line on this metric equates to about $490 million in capital spend this year. As I sit here today, I think we're going to end the year investing between $485 and $495 million. So we're going to be right in the middle. Away from this metric, it's really been a strong year in terms of capital execution for both systems. The water system has implemented a number of project management process changes to ramp up delivery of projects on time and on budget. I expect that momentum to really continue into next year as they continue to have a very robust capital program. We went back and did a little bit of digging, and we have not invested $490 million in 15 years in the system. The last time we invested that much money was 15 years ago, 2004. And the last time we did it, we took on $450 million of debt to fund it. This year is completely cash funded. And on top of that, we've accelerated almost $300 million in debt after we execute phase 2 of the STAR plan, which we're going to talk about today as part of the board meeting. I also wanted to take some time to give a preview on the end of year results from an overall financial metrics standpoint. As Melissa mentioned at the outset, we continue to perform very well financially. On the energy system, our debt and liquidity metrics continue to support AA category ratings. We've paid down $1 billion of debt since 2015, which has meaningfully lowered our debt to capitalization ratio. And we've maintained very good debt service coverage and strong liquidity. On the water side, these financial metrics support AAA category ratings across all three agencies. We've had consistent debt pay down on water as well. Our debt to capitalization levels have come in line and are now trending below our peers. Our debt service coverage has consistently been above 2.75 times. And we still have nearly 1 year of liquidity. The past 13 months have been a big one for debt paydown. I touched on it a little bit earlier. As you know, we introduced the STAR plan. Phase 1 of the STAR plan paid off $205 million in debt. Phase 2 will be $93 million in early debt payment. And that'll save us $109 million of debt service over the coming years. With the completion of phase 1 and phase 2, we'll have paid down nearly $300 million in debt early this year. And when combined with regularly scheduled debt service payments from last October and what's due next Tuesday, it all adds up to $665 million in debt reduction since this meeting a year ago. This reduction is over $3 billion in just 9 years. To put it in perspective, the $3 billion debt pay down in the past 9 years is a reduction of over $8,300 per household in Jacksonville. So to give a little more update on phase 2 of the STAR plan, again, we'll be addressing this today. It requires a few additional approvals from the board today that will be brought as part of the F&A committee report. And these include pricing policy changes, debt management policy changes, and a resolution to approve environmental stabilization fund transfers to recover the costs of solar land and interconnection costs. So, in summary, we continue to deliver results in all aspects of the business. I know there's a lot of noise going on, but the facts of how we're performing today, are as follows. In a 13-month period, we've invested $490 million in cash-funded CapEx in this community. We've paid off $665 million in debt, and we've extended our city contribution. And on the operations and customer side,
We continue to post outstanding results there with two really important takeaways from that. We've posted record performance in the energy system, in the water and wastewater system, and with respect to customer satisfaction. The takeaways are, first, that no matter what's going on in terms of discussion around the future of JEA, we have a phenomenal team of employees who is committed to delivering excellence for our community, and has demonstrated that time and time again. That level of excellence and delivery, second takeaway, gives us the privilege of sitting here and being able to have really important conversations with respect to the future of JEA so that we can figure out how to maximize value, not just today, as measured by CSEF, customer, community, environmental, and financial. Not just tomorrow, but long into the future. And we have the privilege of doing that because of the operational performance and financial performance that we've talked about today. Any questions on the dashboard?
Great job, as always.
Thank you.
Anyone speaking on the collective bargaining, or are we just going to vote on it?
Yeah, John Kendrick will come up and present on collective bargaining.
Madam Chair, did you want to do item D?
But
Of the,
we'll come back.
We'll come back to it.
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members.
Morning.
Draw your attention to tab 3E. There's a memorandum from me to you regarding the approval of JEA's collective bargaining agreements. I'm pleased to announce that we concluded negotiations with all 5 of our bargaining units, and their membership voted and ratified those agreements last week, so all 5 are complete. The memorandum contains details about the number of employees we have in each of the unions, what the wage agreements are in general, and that they were all ratified last week. Those agreements are in appendices I through M of your board materials. I trust you've had a chance to look over those, but a lot of work went into them, and I'd like to thank and congratulate every member of the negotiating teams, both for JEA and the unions. They were 10 teams of very dedicated people who represented themselves well and worked hard to get these done, so we appreciate all the hard work that went into this. The timetable now, we're asking for your approval today, then we will present to City Council as legislation next week, with the assumption that they will vote on it on November 12th if the timetable works out. They are our legislative body for final ratification of these agreements, but we do seek your approval today. What we'll do in the next few weeks is provide training for our employees and managers about what's changed in the agreements, and probably field some questions from the City Council auditors about costing and other information they will want. But basically what we're asking today is the last paragraph of the memorandum. We're recommending that the board approve these collective bargaining agreements that are included in the appendices and approve us presenting them to City Council for ratification.
And before the board votes, you've heard me say numerous times that one of my personal priorities was ensuring that each and every one of our employees was taken care of as we explore the future of JEA. I want to thank personally John and your team. You did a tremendous job, and many of this board need to know that you guys put in hours well into the early mornings, oftentimes 2 or 3 in the morning, as well as the union leadership of IBEW, LIUNA, JSA, and AFSCME, as well as PEA. Each one of those groups, we've reached a collective bargaining agreements with each one of those unions in a very fast period of time, with a great outcome for all that were involved. And I really wanted to emphasize that to this board of directors before you vote.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the collective bargaining agreements in Appendix I, J, K, L, and M?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any questions?
No, I want to ask, John, what are some of the hard questions that you had to answer or deal with to get this? I mean, I know it wasn't a cakewalk.
No, sir. The hard questions were about the pension, about the retention agreement, all those protections we put in place for employees. It was making sure everyone understood what those meant, what the guarantees were, that they were contingent upon recapitalization and not just a given. So we worked through that, and it was a tough challenge to make sure everyone understood and we were all on the same page.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Understanding that an agreement was met, was everyone, did all the leaders feel confident that it was negotiated in their favor?
I think so. Any negotiations, you balance the needs of both sides, but I think it was a very fair representation and a good offer by JEA on the wage increases. And,
Yeah, I
and
thought so
definitely
too. As I
accepted.
was reading through them, I thought so too. All right, if there's no further questions or discussion, please signify by saying aye if you approve.
Aye.
Aye.
Do the same. If not, so moved.
Thank you.
Okay, before we move on to the strategic discussion, I would like to have Ms. Lynn Rhodey advise us regarding our cone of silence responsibility.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to inform the board that the information shared today regarding the JEA Strategic Alternatives procurement process is intended to provide information to the board and transparency to stakeholders. Information provided today will be related to the ITN process that the JEA is undergoing to determine the most advantageous way for the JEA to provide services to its customers. The JEA does not intend to share or provide information that would allow one bidder to have any type of advantage over another, or put any bidder at a disadvantage compared to another bidder. Consequently, the information shared today will be provided at a high level and limited to readily available information. Questions, if any, should be limited to this context so that we preserve the integrity of the public procurement process. If any questions invite or provoke dialogue that may jeopardize the process, council may advise to defer the questions.
Thank you. Okay, can we have Pillsbury, Winthrop, Shaw Pittman, and Foley Lochner come on up?
The board will find at a table, either we have uploaded to Diligent and you can resync, or there is a paper copy at your seat of the material that will be produced. Also, for those in the audience, I believe you can obtain paper copies back at the near the door. So to begin with, I think it's important to kind of revisit the rationale as to why we are exploring all of the options contemplated in the ITN. As the board and the public recognizes, we started in January of 2019 in earnest trying to develop a 10-year strategic plan for JEA that maximizes our 4 areas of measure that have been agreed upon with this board, city council, the administration, and the public. That is community, customer, environmental, and financial, and developing a strategy that balances those 4, maximizing them both now and in the future. To that end, it is the job of this board as well as the management team to look forward. Certainly you heard today that our financial and operating performance this past year is better than it has ever been. And much to the contrary of public statements by third parties, we are not predicting that the sky is falling or that we are in a death spiral. Merely, we are looking at evolving JEA's strategy to be able to participate in the technology disruption trends within the markets, both on the energy and the water side. We are looking at the ability to reshape and be able to manage and maintain the level of talent and drive culture, as we've talked about in our OHI survey in February. We are looking at making sure that this entity continues to have the tools and resources and capital necessary to be able to drive growth and value, as well as to be able to identify ability to invest in the specific trends that are moving forward. Many of these trends are outside of the traditional utility business model. They tend to be in the distributed asset realm, which tends to be behind the meter, which is a place utilities have oftentimes shied away from. And so I wanted to reemphasize that rationale because I think it oftentimes gets drowned out by the conversation of sell versus don't sell, in as opposed to recognizing that what we are trying to achieve is designing a utility that is best suited to serve the needs of its customers both today and in the future and drive those 4 measures of value. As a recap, one of the things we did in strategic planning was evaluate how those 4 measures of value performed over the last 10 years, as well as how they might perform given the set of tools that are currently within the toolkit of JEA's management team and this board of directors. The board of directors may recall that those scenarios were scenarios 2A, the traditional utility response, and scenario 2B, one that's often talked about and not only recently was brought to my attention that certainly JEA could implement a traditional utility response while in parallel pursuing statutory, charter, and constitutional changes. We have always acknowledged that and have considered that to be a legitimate and viable alternative that this board could consider us instructing the management team to implement. It would come with the same type of levers that we would pull as we have pulled in the last 10 years. We would raise rates. We would cut costs. We would cut overhead. We would defer CapEx. As Mr. Wanamaker articulated, we've gotten back to a spending level and investing in our community well north of $400 million, and that's been 15 years since we've had the opportunity to do that. This board may recall that sometime in 2005, 2006, 2007, JEA's debt levels were at record highs, almost 95% debt to assets, and the revenues coming in were exceeded by its expenses. While we are organized as a government, we still do need to run a business. We need to manage our expenses, and the management team at that time, under the leadership of Jim Dickinson and Paul McElroy, took dramatic action that, if you recall, and you were part of this community some 10, 15 years ago, were also big public discourse. And that was raising rates some 71%. And they did that for a very specific purpose. And it was the ability to be able to generate cash, to be able to start paying off the debt that had been taken on by leadership prior. As you've heard, we've been very successful, and we continue to be successful in driving down the debt levels of JEA. In fact, on the water side, we are just now at peer standards. And the electric side, on the energy side, we are still well north of the energy of the standards that are operated on by our industry peers. Most industry peers are below 50th percentile debt to assets, and we're still around 64%, and that does not give an account to off-balance sheet items such as Vogel. So, it is a reminder to this board and to the public that the way we're looking at the world is not a reflection of how we see it today, but matter of how we're looking forward in the future in order to be able to drive those levers of value. To that end, one of the things the management team did was evaluate the tools that were within our purview as management, as well as with this board of directors. And Mr. Vineyard and the legal team of OGC and our special counsel did a very good job of analyzing each one of those tools that are available to us.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the board. If you all remember from the last meeting, we discussed the legal constraints that are placed on entities, government entities like JEA, that make it more difficult for us to move the financial needle in the correct direction. We walked through some ideas about how to remove those legal constraints, how to amend the Constitution, amend the statutes, and to a lesser extent, changing our charter. What we concluded was it was going to take time, money, and there was no certainty in being able to make those changes to our state documents. As a result, the board asked us to explore how we could remove those legal constraints in a way where JEA could be a non-governmental entity. And so we started that process. And what you're about to hear is from Kevin Hyde with Foley and Lardner, and he's going to walk through for y'all the ITN procurement process that we're engaged in. And then you're going to hear from Stephen Amder with the Pillsbury Law Firm he's going to discuss the various corporate structures that JEA may take on as, and I'll say, a non-governmental corporate structure. Kevin?
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Vineyard and Chair Green. Thank you for inviting us back.
And before we go, the rationale around that if the board recalls, was looking at scenarios 3A to 3F, everything from a community-owned co-op type structure through an initial public offering as well as additional partnership tracks. I'm happy to report, and the team will go through this. We are investigating each one of those scenarios, and this presentation is intended to inform this board as well as the public of the level of analysis and depth in which we are proceeding as management.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I'm going to break this up into a couple pieces, and as Mr. Zahn has already alluded, I'm going to be talking specifically about the ITN process that's being undergone right now. Stephen Amberdor with the Pillsbury Law Firm is going to talk about the alternative structures, and we'll walk through some of those in great depth. You see in our initial slide there, we are very pleased to assist and represent JEA, myself as the managing partner of the Jacksonville office of Foley & Lardner, Mr. Amdur from Pillsbury, certainly a well-known law firm with great capability in this area, and as one would expect with a potential transaction of this depth and complexity, outside advisors, the well-known Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley. And I'm pleased to report that the four teams are working very well together, and all of us appreciate that opportunity because it is unique what is going on. You will recall 2 months ago we were together when this board voted on July 23rd to authorize the management team to engage in a process which has now become known as ITN, or a competitive bid process. Ms. Rohde has already laid out the framework of that, of what we are in, the cone of silence, the fact that we're in a competitive process. But what I really want to emphasize as we're in the middle of this process right now, begun on July 23rd with your board vote, begun on August 2nd with the posting of the ITN to the website, that the purpose of this is to competitively solicit replies. And if it seems redundant as I go through this talking about the nature of competition, that's what it's for, so that we have a transparent and competitive process that is fair to all. And we are not breaking any new ground here. Everything that is being done is firmly rooted not only within the JEA Procurement Code, but also state law upon which the JEA Procurement Code is based. And you're very familiar, having gone through, for instance, recently the downtown headquarters procurement process. So this is not unique. The subject matter might be unique, but the process really is not. The twin goals have always been to ensure a process and a procedure that ensures fairness. A fairness that then leads to public confidence, which I know is of great importance to you all as board members, as fiduciaries of this very important consideration that you're making. And as I've already emphasized, is to ensure that the greatest amount of competition among the respondents so that you can maximize the potential outcomes for both JEA, the customers, and this community which you for so long have served. So how did we do that? In our next slide, you're going to see the beginnings of just the outline of the process. So when you voted on July 23rd to authorize the process, it really began with the posting of the ITN on August 2nd to the JEA website, an ITN that is still available to this day to be viewed on the JEA website for anyone who wants to review it. And as I suggested, many of the concepts that we're going through now are very similar to what you went through with the downtown headquarter building. We're now going to be moving to the first phase after this, or the first phase that we're in, which is the solicitation phase. This is exactly where we're at, what Ms. Rohde was referring to with regard to the process. The timelines that I'm going to talk about now, we know this to be true. August 2nd, posting of the ITN, through October 7th. You will recall that originally it was scheduled in after September 30th, but with the potential of impact of Dorian, that was extended an extra week. So during the solicitation phase, when respondents are being invited to reply to this ITN, the ITN was posted, very well explained what the process was going to be. Potential respondents had an opportunity to submit questions. The questions were then answered in great detail. Those questions and answers were posted on the website. I reviewed again this morning. They are available for anyone to see. And the thing that this is going to lead to after October 7th is a public meeting to formally receive the replies, often called a bid opening. There's been questions about when does the public get involved. October 7th is going to be one of those times when the public is going to see exactly who is interested in participating in this ITN. And again, that will be a public meeting. Following that solicitation phase, we're going to go to a second phase, which will be known as evaluation. The timeline is a little bit more indefinite, but I think it's fair to say that a 2-week period of October 7th, 2019 through October 21st What is going to be going on during this evaluation phase is that the responsive replies, those respondents who have issued a reply, are going to be evaluated against the criteria that this board set. 3.2.3 of the ITN lays out in specific detail what you all set as the mandatory minimum requirements for anything to be viewed as a successful reply. It's there where you were talking about ensuring protection for the employee benefits. It's there that you were talking about environmental concerns. It's there you were talking about all the things that this board deemed to be critically important and absolutely necessary for anyone to be deemed a successful replier. And so the evaluation team, which will be set by JEA, will look to see, in the first instance, did the reply meet those mandatory minimum requirements? It's a pass or fail question. In fact, I like how in the ITN it actually lists those questions and says pass or fail. And if you don't pass, then the respondent or the reply fails, and therefore it is not going to be further considered. But it doesn't stop just there. The evaluation team then has to look at those that did meet the mandatory minimum requirements and ask some additional questions, which you see posted there. For instance, in addition to just passing the bare minimum requirements, did you achieve JEA's goals in the ITN? Were you thoughtful in the response to really prove, as Mr. Zahn talked about, additional value to JEA and to our community? Do you have experience and customer commitment, demonstrated experience? Are you willing to provide economic benefits and development benefits to Jacksonville? Are you willing to provide the protection that Mr. Kendrick talked about to the employees, in which this board has already said is so critical? How innovative was your reply? Was it out-of-the-box thinking to meet the goal that Mr. Zahn and others have talked about of not just meeting today's needs, but in the future? A real demonstration through past experience to community stewards, because we all know JEA is an integral part of this community. And financial stability. Do you have the wherewithal to complete a transaction should this board ever decide that would be the best course, and the city council to decide that's something that it would want to approve? So within that evaluation phase, the evaluation team will decide which, if any, respondents have met the requirements, the passes fail, as well as the additional considerations, and decide on a potential number for further negotiation, which leads us to the next slide, into the next phase. After that group of respondents is chosen, we then move to the negotiation phase, estimated to begin in October of 2019, but most importantly, begun when everybody is comfortable that it is time to begin and all the facts are known. That negotiation team will then meet with any number of selected respondents. It is not one or the other. It's the entire group of selected respondents in order to see what the best contract, if any, can be achieved. It's important to understand, and this is all done pursuant to state law, that those negotiations will be in private, but there will be a record of those negotiations. In fact, they will be recorded to be released at such point in time as the intent to notice to provide a contract is awarded. Now, why is that important? While that is being done in private during the time of negotiations, ultimately the public will know exactly what was said and done to reach the point that any contract, if suggested and recommended, would be done. So again, not any set number of respondents. It is going to be a record of those negotiations, a recording of those negotiations, and importantly, while there is a negotiation team set for JEA, subject matter experts will be appointed to assist in particular areas where additional expertise is needed. Why is that being done? That's so that your negotiating team will have the very best expertise necessary so that it can reach the very best deal, if at all possible. After the negotiations conclude, the negotiation team will meet in a public meeting to discuss its recommended award, another touch point for the public involvement there. If it is decided to recommend a contract, a notice of intent to award, that will be posted on the JEA procurement page, which is where all of the documents that we've been talking about are produced. Now, one of the questions that I've heard is, well, how is the integrity of the ITN process going to be ensured? And Ms. Rohde has already alluded to that, the so-called cone of silence. That is not a term of art to JEA. It is not a term of art dreamed up by myself or Mr. Amdur. It is a term of art that is embedded in the law. We're not going to take time to read it, but it goes back to 1931, when the Florida Supreme Court recognized in order for the public to have confidence in any procurement and process, integrity and impartiality are absolutely key. And that's why we see on the next slide a brief explanation of the cone of silence, which Ms. Rohde has already talked to us about. So what is it very briefly? It is a prohibition, and let me underscore that, it is a prohibition, a thou shalt not, of ex parte communications between potential bidders and JEA and its representative. It is meant to be as clean of a process as if you were to go to court and one party hasn't talked to the judge beforehand. It is meant to be equal and fair bidding for everyone. Again, where does it come about? Deeply explained in the ITN, and it is founded in JEA's procurement code, which existed well before the ITN. What is ex parte communication? Very simply, any oral or written communication relative to the solicitation, the evaluation, the award or contract that occurs outside of a publicly noticed meeting called by JEA related to that procurement. So it is meant to be a very strict cone of silence. But why does it exist? Remember, we've been talking about competition, transparency, integrity. That's exactly why it exists. The cone of silence exists to ensure that no vendor who wants to reply is placed at some informational or competitive disadvantage because someone else has more information than they have. It's to ensure that no vendor makes contact while a procurement is pending in order to influence the decision makers. And as you know, there's many decision makers in this process, starting with this board and going up through Councilmember Becton and his colleagues on the City Council. And because ex parte communication has the potential to deny competitive, fair, open, and partial consideration, that's why that prohibition exists in such a way. And to underscore it's important, things can happen if the cone of silence is not observed, and that's why Ms. Rhodey was so accurate in reminding us exactly where we are at as we began even this discussion in this public meeting. Well, if a respondent violates the cone of silence, they may be disqualified from further participation. It's also possible that a JEA employee or a representative could be disqualified from further participation. And as the Office of General Counsel of the City of Jacksonville has already indicated, this board is a representative, obviously, of JEA, subject to the cone of silence, as is the City Council because of their role, important role, in this cone of silence. The whole thing that is to be done is we don't want there to be any violation of the integrity of the process that may result in a bid protest, a disqualification of someone who is involved in the process, merely based on improper ex parte communication. So while we're in this whole process, and remember, this runs through not only August 2nd through October 7th, or the evaluation phase or the negotiation phase, it goes through the notice of an intent to award a contract, or if there is a challenge to that, until that challenge is completed. And I think everyone understands this cone of silence, but I think it's important for us to remember who it's subject to: potential bidders, JEA employees, agents and representatives, and in fact, the only exceptions for JEA employees are those that are currently designated as a procurement representative, Mr. McCarthy and Ms. McCullum. They are outside of the cone of silence, so they can receive information such as they did when receiving the questions and responding to them that has otherwise been received. As I said, you all as board members, the city council members, and even members of the mayor's office are subject to this cone of silence as well. So, where does the public really get involved again in this process? There are, in addition to what I've already described, such as the bid opening or when the negotiation team announces who is going to be the recommended intent to award, if any, 3 very significant times for public comment, discussion, debate, and input. Starts with you all, first of all. If there is going to be a recommended intent to award a contract, it will come to this board. And obviously, you will meet in a public meeting, as you are already doing and as you're doing now, to review, discuss, and decide whether to approve that recommended award of contract. And as you've already seen this morning, I'm sure that you'll have public comment, as you do at each of your meetings. So public meetings, opportunity for public comment. It then would go, should you approve something, to the city council, who will follow the same process it does as with any bills, and certainly bills of great importance to this community. Review, debate, public comment, and input. And they're going to have an opportunity to decide as a legislative body whether to approve the contract, if any, that this board has approved. But ultimately, we know by charter, and I think it's a good thing, this community has an opportunity. The ultimate public comment through the voter referendum, which may be held, or which would be held, if a contract is approved by this board and approved by the city council. So lots of opportunity for public comment. I realize there's maybe a desire to have it sooner rather than later, But again, operating both to the procurement code and state law, this process is being meticulously followed, not only because of its importance to this community, but because that's the law. And I appreciate the opportunity to work with you in making sure that the process is being followed, and to this board's real commitment to adhering in such a strong way. Turn it over now to Mr. Amdur.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde. Before Mr. Amdur continues on, I want to make one slight correction to something that we've talked quite a bit about. At the bid opening on October 7th, we will be opening the bids in a public meeting. However, in order to not provide competitive advantage to any one respondent, the names of the bidders will not be released. Merely the number of respondents that have responded will be released. Just want to make that one point of clarification.
Absolutely.
I'm
You're correct.
sorry about that.
No, you're correct.
Madam Chair, members of the board, thank you for having me here today, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to be a part of this process. I'm Stephen Amdur. I'm chair of the New York Corporate Department of Pillsbury Winthrop. Very pleased to be advising JEA in connection with the Strategic Alternative Review, working with talented advisors such as Kevin and his team, as well as the banks that he mentioned before. As discussed previously, we are continuing to work with JEA and the management team and advisors to explore the feasibility of the non-traditional response scenarios that were discussed in the July board meeting. To quickly recap, those would be 3A, community ownership, 3B, the initial public offering, 3C, private placement, 3D, technology conversion, 3E, oil and gas conversion, and 3F, utility conversion. Now, each of the particular scenarios presents its own potential obstacles and issues to be explored. Per instructions of the board at the prior meeting, all teams are exploring all potential outcomes with the goal of maximizing the overall value to the city and the ratepayers. There's no outcome that has been preordained. There's nothing that's off the table, including but not limited to no transaction whatsoever. All of the options are being analyzed in terms of the feasibility of achieving the stated goals for customer, community, environmental, and financial impact. Now, the ITN process itself is anticipated to result into responses that will fall into scenarios 3C to 3F. Accordingly, to ensure that all potential scenarios are explored, JEA and its advisors are exploring the feasibility of autonomously pursuing scenarios 3A, community ownership, and 3B, IPO. Going to 3A, community ownership, that would result in the conversion of JEA to an organization which is owned and run jointly by its customers as members who would share the profits or benefits. That transaction would result in JEA becoming a private entity operating its utility services through applicable franchise agreements with the City of Jacksonville, and it would be owned by customer members. In order to understand the steps in consideration, there's a comprehensive regulatory and legal review that we are currently conducting, assessing the regulatory and statutory basis for the formation of a cooperative under Florida law and the provision of electricity, water, and other services under applicable law. In order to conduct a community ownership conversion, we would need to form a cooperative entity, transfer the assets to that entity, establish a board of trustees and relevant regional boundaries for trustee representation, comply with all regulatory and legal requirements, and have a comprehensive member onboarding process. The determination of the membership base and the pro rata portion of appropriate purchase price from each member to achieve the minimum requirements would have to be explored and conducted appropriately. Customers would then sign membership agreements, pay for their membership interest in the cooperative, and there would be a going forward implementation of an on-offboarding process for members as they move in or out of the coverage area. We anticipate that this process would take approximately 9 to 18 months from the particular provision selection, subject to applicable approvals. Moving to an initial public offering, that would involve a conversion of JEA to a corporation and an offering of shares to the public in a new stock issuance. JEA would become a public entity listed on a selected stock exchange, would operate its utility services through applicable franchise agreements with the City of Jacksonville. Individual and institutional shareholders would purchase and own common stock in the public company. In order for the IPO to be the selected process, we would need to develop the corporate structure for a post-closing IPO entity, which would involve an incorporation of a new entity to issue shares of common stock. All assets of JEA would need to be transferred to that entity, involving a number of regulatory and legal analyses to determine the appropriateness of each individual transfer under applicable law. As a public company, JEA would be required to comply with a number of public company guidelines. Obviously, there would be a public company board, including an audit, compensation, nominating, and corporate governance committee. Directors would need to be selected in accordance with independence and applicable exchange guidelines. Committee members would need to meet specific requirements. Certain internal controls and disclosure controls over financial reporting would need to be implemented in compliance with Sarbanes-Oxley, as well as new additional corporate policies involving the operation of JEA as a public company. The actual process for pursuing an IPO, in addition to the legal transfer to a new entity, would involve a comprehensive back and forth with the Securities Exchange Commission, requiring numerous public filings, including a Form S-1 and prospectus. This registration statement would be filed. There would be back and forth with the SEC, and ultimately it would become effective, and shares could be sold to the public. A comprehensive marketing process involving selection of underwriters, selection of stock exchange, preparation of model, similar investor day analyses. Numerous considerations are still being considered and walked through on our end, and as along with the JEA management team and other advisors, including but not limited to the interplay of mandated SEC communications with Florida public record law, confirming the analysis on post-closing governance and operations, confirming whether the city of Jacksonville will be able, under applicable law, to own a minority stake in a public company, and if not, necessary steps to amend to permit that action to occur, or to develop a structure in which all shares would be sold to the public as of the closing. Moving on to private placement. In a private placement, JEA would be converted to a corporation, and a placement of equity shares would be sold to private sector investors. JEA would become a private entity operating its utility services through applicable franchise agreements with the city of Jacksonville, and would be owned by applicable qualified investors. In a private placement similar to the IPO, there would be a potential for an ongoing minority or even majority ownership stake by the city of Jacksonville. Again, this would be subject to regulatory and legal analyses and confirming that the city of Jacksonville is able to hold shares in a private entity, including similar analyses to that which would be done in 3B and IPO. In the private placement, we would similarly need to develop a separate independent corporate structure, transfer the JEA assets to that new entity, and do a legal and regulatory analysis confirming that the new entity was able to operate and continue to provide services under applicable law. Similarly, in a private placement, if there is a minority stake held, we would need to determine post-closing governance and operations, what the appropriate governing bodies were and the makeup of those entities, minority and majority investor rights and guidelines, and certain ongoing operations given the restraints that would be inherent with ongoing municipal ownership. Technology conversion, oil and gas conversion, and utility conversion. Now, all of these have similar ongoing analyses, including but not limited to the overall structure of any individual transaction. The largest difference between 3D, 3E, and 3F is going to go to the ultimate purchasing entity and the ongoing operations following the closing. In 3C, technology conversion, JEA would be converted to a corporation, and a tech-focused company would purchase the controlling interest in JEA. JEA would become a private subsidiary company of that tech-focused company, operating its utility services through applicable franchise agreements with the city of Jacksonville, and be majority owned by that tech parent company. In each of 3D, 3E, and 3F, we would need to develop the structure for the transaction that most efficiently transfers all assets of JEA to a new private company. We would need to transfer those assets to that new investor entity, determine the appropriate steps for legal regulatory review, including requisite real property, environmental, intellectual property, and other legal and financial considerations. We need the appropriate requisite approvals, which are anticipated to be a multiple-month process. We need to negotiate the appropriate agreements for the conversion, including the appropriate purchase and sale agreements, transfer documentation, and ongoing commitments to the municipality from the buyer entity. We're continuing to analyze the scope of the approval process and the level of interest from potential third parties. And you'll see that in each of the scenarios that we outlined here, 3A through 3F, we anticipate the approximate timetable would be 9 to 18 months from the selection by the board of a particular path forward, which again are going to be subject to appropriate approvals from legal regulatory bodies. Now, Kevin highlighted a few of the key anticipated process dates, and just want to flag them again for the board's consideration and review. We anticipate that following the bid opening on October 7th, there will be an evaluation team meeting. There will be posting of an intent to negotiate, and we'll begin the negotiation phase. We've circled up October 19th, but again, this is just a potential date. As Kevin highlighted before, the negotiation will begin when the appropriate teams have been formed and the analyses are ready. We anticipate there will be a multiple month process to analyze the bids and conduct the negotiation, and that the engagement of the City Council and the public will begin following board selection of a particular process forward that would likely occur in March.
Thank you. Well, I hope that helped everyone walking through it. Definitely helped me. There were quite a few questions that I had that were answered along the way. As a board member, not knowing what we can and cannot ask, so I really appreciate that. I have a question for Aaron. You mentioned that when the final, if the final candidates or firms are selected or scenarios, it would be opened in a public meeting, but we would not announce the names. Is there a reason for that?
Sure. So the initial responses that are due on October 7th will be initial replies. Those replies will be indications of interest that, as Mr. Hyde articulated, will demonstrate an ability to meet this board's minimum requirements, as well as provide replies that are commensurate with the other additional evaluation criteria set forth in Section 3.2.3 of the ITN. Unlike real estate or potentially other, call it construction projects, because of the uniqueness of this potential investigation, it would provide respondents a significant advantage or disadvantage relative to maximizing the potential value for JEA if the names were made public. So what that means is, certainly it is the job of this staff and this board to maximize the value that it is able to obtain through the process of the ITN for the benefit of this community and for JEA's customers. And by having a cloaked process relative to the names but not the numbers, provides us a significant competitive advantage relative to dealing with any of the respondents through the negotiation process. It would also provide respondents potentially, because of the complex operating nature and the interfacing of the electric and water systems, they would potentially have an advantage should they know who was on the other side as well.
Okay, thank you for that. In the same vein of operating under the cone of silence, are rating agencies asking for any updates about the process?
I'll ask Mr. Wanamaker to approach the podium. The answer is yes. Certainly, the ITN process is a process that Jacksonville is undertaking and is being watched worldwide. I can assure you, when I hear from people in Singapore that they're watching to see, it is truly a landmark type transaction that is being contemplated and thinking about how does a utility continue to drive value in the face of ever market trending changes in our market. And Mr. Wanamaker can give some articulation in terms of the discussions that we've had with rating agencies.
Yeah, we have met with all the rating agencies since the July 23rd board meeting. We've given them an update on the process. We met with them in March. We walked them through the overall strategic planning process and kind of what was taking place at that time. We've been giving them constant updates, and we've met a number of them face to face since the July 23rd meeting, again, to continue to update them. At this time, they have not had any additional comments. S&P did publish a report, but it was over a general commentary of kind of what was going on. So.
I'll tell you, just to add a little bit additional color, one of the conversations is been around why is JEA's board and management team undertaking strategic planning in such a public way? Why aren't you just doing this like every other utility behind a closed door and then coming out when you have your plan? And we had to take significant time because, as we all know, being members of this community, that has caused substantial community conversation, absent having actually the facts to talk about. And so oftentimes we have members in our community that take a position one way or the other without having complete information. And that has caused either significant third-party reports to be erroneous or misleading or have misstatements, and those are reports that are oftentimes reviewed by the rating agencies as their only access to information. And our response was that we felt as a board and as a management team that it was, given the significance of this potential transformation, that we wanted to be as transparent and open with the community as possible and to allow for everyone to see the decision-making as we've been moving forward. I can assure you individually it's been uncomfortable, but it is obvious, but they understood and appreciated when we explained to them the scenario strategic planning process that we were following, why it added value for the community to be able to see this given the significance. The second major comment was that, and this is more general, they all understand and recognize the impact of technology disruption on the traditional utility model. That is not isolated to government entities or private entities. It is all utilities. I know a lot has been made about whether it's public versus private, and the answer we continue to tell people is that's not the question. The question is, how do you design the utility to be able to provide the highest quality service at the most affordable cost, both on the energy and water side, in the face of the technology disruption that we are seeing in the market. To that end, what starts normally with our rating agencies is a conversation of public versus private does very quickly then migrate to, that's a very interesting position for the board and management team to be taking, and let's see how this process rolls out, because it'll be at least you're doing it in a way where we'll be able to have all the information on the table. So I won't say that those conversations are all great, but those are the two major feedback points. Number one is they're confused why we're being so open. Understandably, I understand that, but they also are aligned relative to the impacts of solar, storage, distributed water, electrification, on-road and off-road, in terms of how they have an impact on a vertically integrated utility.
Thank you, Ryan. Anyone else on the board have any questions?
If I may, through the chair. When we take a look at the listing of all of the potential alternative structures from a process perspective with the ITN, is there a requirement for there to be a response in a particular structure type in order for that potential structure to continue in terms of the evaluation process?
So if I may I restate the question and so I can clarify it? You're asking if no respondent that is a tech-focused company responds, would that silo of investigation continue?
Correct.
The answer would be no. Now, there are two segments, which are the co-op and the IPO, which can be explored vis-a the advisors that we've engaged, both from a legal, regulatory, as well as capital markets execution capability. That's the co-op and the IPO strategy. Those certainly can be explored and will be to the fullest extent so that we can provide this board and the community a response. But to the extent, we've done one of the main reasons we've engaged JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Pillsbury and Foley, four significant global leading entities relative to transactions of this complexity, is to ensure that all industry segments obtained at least the bid documents and the ITN notification so that we could gauge whether they're interested. It very well may be that while that is an area that we thought was worth exploring, that those companies are focused on some other growth activity and so therefore they don't respond. In which case then there's nothing more for us to investigate.
Thank you. Any other questions? No. Thank you so much. Before we move on to committee reports, I'm going to back up to, what section is that? For 3D, for the 2020 proposed Board of Directors meeting schedule. Mr. Zahn, would you like to review that?
Sure. As we did in 2019, the proposed meeting schedule is to remain on the fourth Tuesday of each month, as at 9 a.m. That seemed to have worked for the prior board, but certainly we have new board members and open it up to the board's conversation as to whether or not they'd like to have a change.
It's worked for me.
Hearing nothing, we will proceed accordingly.
Sounds good. Or do we need to actually take an action on that?
No.
Okay, great. All right, committee reports. Board Member Flanagan,
Thank you.
Finance and Audit Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Finance and Audit Committee met, and the materials are included within your board packets, but I'll read for the record those topics which the committee received. In addition to adoption of the agenda and approval of the minutes, we also received a quarterly audit services update, as well as an annual approval of internal audit charter recommendation for the full board approval, as well as the annual audit internal plan recommendation for approval. We also received the enterprise risk management update, as well as the ethics officer quarterly report, the annual financial audit plan from Ernst & Young, as well as a recommendation for pricing policy revision, as well as recommendation for debt management policy revision. And we received reports on the electric system and water and sewer system reserve fund, as well as the JEA energy market risk management policy report, and conducted our committee discussions with E&Y, as well as our Director of Audit Services. Mr. Wanamaker has joined us at the table today to take us through the authorizations for the use of electrical environmental funds to approve projects, and then following that, given the lack of quorum at the Finance and Audit Committee, be bringing forward these recommendations from the committee for collective ratification by the entire board.
So the presentation, perfect. So as part of the Finance and Audit Committee last month, we had a couple of items with regard to the pricing policy and the debt management policy that we needed approval for and changes to affect the STAR Plan Phase 2. The third element of that is the Environmental Stabilization Fund. And so this is being brought to the board today to the whole board today. The Environmental Fund was established in 2007 to recover costs associated with environmental remediation, environmental projects, and environmental compliance costs. The funds can only be spent with board approval and only for designated purposes. And so that's what we're here to talk about. And so at this time, in order to affect STAR Plan Phase 2, along with the other changes that were taken and recommended today by the Finance and Audit Committee, we're recommending the board authorize the use of the stabilization fund to recover the cost of expanding JEA's solar footprint. So the costs include land and interconnection costs associated with the 250 megawatts of solar capacity that we are adding to our system over the next several years. This is a breakdown of those costs. These detailed schedules are provided in your board package behind proposed resolution 2019-12. But to summarize, we had $30 million in funds that were spent in fiscal year 2018. That was primarily on land. We are proposing to recover those costs over a 5-year period. The remaining project costs would be recovered in the year incurred. And so recovery of these projects from the Environmental Fund will allow additional proceeds to be utilized for early debt retirement in conjunction with the STAR Plan Phase 2. So in conclusion, we're recommending the board approve and adopt Resolution 2019-12, authorizing the use of the Electric System Environmental Stabilization Fund to fund the stated projects, and to authorize the managing director and CEO to transfer such funds as necessary.
Anyone have any questions?
One thing, just as a reminder for new members, at the beginning of this year, we executed take and pay power purchase agreements for 250 megawatts of solar where we own the land. That's the projects that Mr. Wanamaker is alluding to. That 250 megawatts of solar, if the board recalls, is well below our fuel rate, about 20% below our fuel rate, so a substantial discount for the benefit of our customers, as well as also the environment, and provides us a long-term hedge towards fuel costs as we look forward in terms of rate stability from a fuel perspective, and quite candidly puts the city of Jacksonville in a leadership position in the United States relative to the percentage of energy provided by renewables with that project. And then the STAR plan is, as Mr. Wanamaker articulated, a continuance of an effort to get our balance sheet into an appropriate position to deal with the trends in the market.
Okay, any questions from the board? Can we get a motion? Looks like, well, since you didn't have a quorum, do we need to adopt the agenda?
If I can move and suggest a motion for ratification of the Finance and Audit Committee's activities.
So moved.
To clarify, Madam Chair, so we were talking about item 6A, 1, 2, 4, 5, 9, 10, and 14.
Correct, everyone understand that? Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion approved.
Thank you.
Before we move on, I think this has happened a couple of months where we haven't had a quorum for the Finance and Audit Committee. Mr. Brown, would you be interested in serving on our?
Sure.
Thank you so much. And does that even out and give us a quorum for that particular committee?
Does, thank you.
Good. Thank you again.
Cool.
All righty. Any old business? Any new business?
Yes, Madam Chair. The other week, when the Finance Committee had their meeting on the retirement legislation, I was there. Of course, the vote was 6-1. But I noticed even after that, I've been kind of following that. And, of course, there's a lot of politics. But there's also a lot of misunderstanding as it relates to us giving our senior leadership the power to investigate the non-traditional approach. I just think that it may be wise on our part to empower them with the same authority to look at our traditional approach, or option rather, not approach, but option, so that maybe a side-by-side analysis would be helpful in just seeing where the two would lead us. I mean, we're looking at the non-traditional, but where will the traditional lead us, if that makes sense? I was just thinking in that vein, and maybe that's something that we want to talk about. Or can we, at this point, give them, well, I know we can we empower them to investigate, even as we've investigated to this, to a certain degree, the non-traditional? What would the traditional look like?
When you say what does the traditional look like, you want to see what we've presented prior, the number of employees that we would have to terminate? the amount of service that we would have to pull back in terms of the quality and response time, versus this is just an exploratory motion that we're doing here, is to go out and to explore. So are
Right.
you saying that you want them to see what the impact of
What-
the traditional response?
What the actual impact would be, yes.
And we did something similar when we presented the scenarios, I believe.
Yeah, we did. Are you asking us to go farther than just the analysis and to look at in parallel?
Yes.
Raising rates and
Right.
and come back with potential recommendations in the interim of how we might execute?
Yes.
Okay. We can certainly take that type of direction. If the board, wants us to do that, perhaps I can take it as a takeaway of thinking about, coming back with, or working with the management team to look at rate adjustments and expense management. Certainly we, as you can tell, manage operationally and financially very well through this past year, but we have been certainly maintaining status quo operations and not making dramatic shifts within the business. I can certainly come back with some ideas on that.
Okay.
Politics.
It's going to always be there.
I understand that it's going to always be there, and I always question. We all tend to question the motives because a decision has not been made, and I think the politics are responding as though a decision has been made. This is an action to explore opportunities to maximize JEA's potential.
Right.
It's that simple. Today, the presentations that we had today were just to make sure that everyone understands that we want to make sure that there is integrity in this process. And to go even a step further, it doesn't just stop here. A decision making does not just stop here at this board. It then goes on to our city council and then ultimately to the community. I'm hesitant to respond to politically motivated
But sometimes,
request.
Madam Chair, sometimes to get ahead of certain things, I think it just would be wise on our part. Not that we'll necessarily respond into politics, but there are some serious-minded people who have been influenced.
Yes, sir.
And I just think that the more information we gather, the more we put out, the better served we will be.
I agree. I had a similar thought. I thought maybe a lot of the critics that we're getting for the process is because they're not at the table. And so I questioned, how can we, understanding that we have to function under the cone of silence, but how can we invite someone from city council? And I believe
Yep.
Aaron has done some research, and we may have some headway of, once again, we're constantly having to show the integrity of the process. No different than we did for the headquarters.
Right.
And that didn't seem like it was enough.
Right.
So you want to give some insight on what some of the possibilities may be to bring.
Sure. So one of the things that I did in discussion with the chair as well as with the president of the city council, Scott Wilson, talked about the ability to find a way for city council to be able to have some degree of input and oversight as JEA's management team runs this ITN process. I hope the presentation today provided the public and this board a great degree of comfort with the professionalism and the integrity upon which we are proceeding. But oftentimes perception sometimes becomes reality. And so to that end, in working with Foley, we've been able to identify a way where I've spoken with Councilman Becton about elevating the role of the JEA liaison as a participant and input provider for the ITN process, and to allow for the Councilman Becton the opportunity to provide oversight and ensure the integrity, to gather the council's desires and some inputs so that they have an avenue to be able to provide information to JEA for our consideration as we proceed through the process, and to be able to report back to the city council that, in fact, in his role, he's being able to provide some oversight, so, much like a shareholder might do in a traditional, corporate world, to ensure that the shareholders' interests are represented. We haven't identified exactly the specific structure on how to do that without violating, number one, the cone of silence, and number two, the integrity of his vote should it ever be necessary. But I've spoken with him, and I believe, Councilman Becton, you've agreed to take on that role?
I have, and look forward to providing that transparency for the council and exchanging communication where necessary to help alleviate concerns of the council that they don't have a dog in the fight in terms of upfront, and look forward to however that transpires and works itself out.
Yeah. The hope being that certainly as Mr. Hyde articulated during his presentation, there will be ample opportunity for both council and the public to weigh in. But in the meantime, providing a representative of those bodies to the opportunity to be behind the curtain, so to speak, and give their insight and also be able to report out the integrity of the process, I think is a very valuable tool for the community, especially somebody that has the history of participating on the subcommittee on JEA a number of years ago and being a very impartial observer of kind of the JEA's future, and certainly we thank him for his willingness to serve in that capacity. It's welcome to the field.
Should be fun. Entertaining too.
Thank you. Rest of the board members, any comments on Reverend Newbill's request?
Well, I have a question related to that. Wouldn't the traditional response, isn't that how your forecast and planning is done today by default, is the traditional response? So any forward-looking information, any forecast, that's essentially based on a traditional response. Is that not correct?
Yeah, so, and recognize this is the first meeting, that there are two scenarios we've presented first. The
Right.
first is the status quo, which is effectively continuing to maintain the operational service levels that we have today going forward and placing the entire burden of declining sales on the customer. What that would result in is something around a 50 to 60% increase in rates. After presenting that scenario number one, and we called that the status quo, the board had requested management to go evaluate the other tools that were available to us, and to look at potentially making trade-offs. And so the traditional response really was looking at substantial overhead cuts as well as deferrals of CapEx, which might lead to degradation in service quality. So, and some of that, to be candid, is really just a representative of what was already done for the last 10 years. Because if you look at the last 10 years, rates were raised 71%. CapEx was deferred. You heard Mr. Wanamaker talk about how we're just now reaching back to normalized investments back in our system. So we were deferring CapEx, which has an impact on the longevity and performance of our systems. We also had reduced overhead by 20%. So it really was a continuation of those trends. And what we had talked about with the board of directors was that given that the fact that the strategic planning process really was only about a 6 to 12 month period of time, continue to operate under the status quo, we have the ability to do that, and the luxury is afforded to us by the STAR plan, which has provided the expense reduction that has allowed for us to have the increasing expenses and not have rate increases today. That being said, per I think Reverend Newbill's perspective, it doesn't change the business issue that we're facing. It does certainly, it alleviates the short-term relief. And so, I certainly can come back with recommended rate changes and potential expense adjustments should this board want us to start executing on that. I would say as a CEO, my word would be that I think we ought to stay the course and be able to evaluate a way to maximize value. And hopefully the community and policymakers would afford us the luxury to be able to use this 6 to 9 months to be able to provide all the facts and the data. But in the event we can't, that's what we're left with.
Andy, any comments? Okay. Any comments? Okay, are we moving forward with the request, or we can?
Yeah, I can
You'll
take
put
it
together
away.
something? Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, Management Director's report?
One significant one, Mr. Campion provided his resignation as Board of Directors. Sad to see him go, but certainly his input and mentorship over the last year has been substantial, not at the table, but for this team, this senior leadership team, he's been a very significant wealth of knowledge and insight in how we think about this, and we're sad to see him go. We'll do something similar to recognize his service, but I wanted to just say publicly thank you very much, John, for all that you did, both personally and professionally, to provide the mentorship to this board, this community, and the entire senior leadership team.
Thank you. Real quick, Chairman Sparrow, I just want to commend Carrie Stewart and her communication team during Hurricane Dorian. The communication was over the top. At least for me, not just as a board member, but as a ratepayer, anytime I wondered anything, I didn't have to wait on a news report. I didn't have to wait for the scheduled EOC reports. That communication came through via email, via text, through alerts. It was phenomenal. To Melissa Dykes and Aaron, you guys steadfast. EOC, I even visited the EOC, and Aaron was right there. And I understand, Melissa, you were here holding down the fort back at the office. And so just want to thank you and commend you. I hope that the customers felt and were able to witness the hard work that was done. And it gives me a little bit of peace that if that storm or a storm was to hit our community, that JEA is prepared. So I just wanted to say thank you. And if there are no other comments.
Madam Chair, I want to echo what you said. Really, I felt proud to be a member of this board.
Yeah. All right, good. If there's no other comments, this meeting is adjourned.